This meeting is being recorded.
Whoa.
That was incredibly loud.
Woke me up.
For those of you in the room, we're just waiting for all attendees to sign in, and then we'll start.
We'll give it a couple of minutes, let people get their coffees. Feels like we should have some background music, you know, like a waiting music or something. Numbers are still going up.
I've got ACDs back in black, if that helps.
Might be a bit unsoothing.
Yeah. Wrong kind of vibe.
I once worked for Fujitsu and we had literally had a company song.
Brilliant. I think we can get things started.
Go for it, Andy.
Smashing. So welcome everybody. Thank you for attending. This is the transport technology engagement session for suppliers from CCS. So just do a quick round of introductions. My name's Andy. I'm the procurement lead for transport technology, the replacement product for transport tech and associated services. And Connie.
Hi, my name's Connie Hutchins. I'm the head of transport technology and cyber within the tech services team within CCS. So yeah, looking forward to getting some good insight. We have a few questions and a few slides and charts and stuff, but you know, your input is always absolutely vital in terms of how we form and create these agreements. I'll introduce Steve. Hi, Steve.
Hi all, afternoon. Yep, Steve Sopp. So I'm commercial lead supporting the TTAS and VSIS commercial teams, and also have been doing quite a bit of the strategy work that's feeding into Andy and the work to implement the new agreement.
Smashing, thank you. So we'll share the agenda. So this was shared in the briefing pack if you've had the time to read that. So we'll cover an overview of this event. We'll talk about what the session is, and then we'll jump into a session that'll be interactive. We're running that through Menti. So we'll be soliciting your feedback and then opening up for a discussion about what we think the options can be for the new framework, and if there's any questions about new regulations or anything like that. While we're running the session, we ask, I don't know if you can do this yourself, so it might be a null point, but keep your cameras and microphones off unless we're discussing feedback. We are listed as hosts, so we've got the ability to unmute you. So if people pop their hand up if they've got a question, we can work that way. Please answer as honestly and detailed as you can. Critical feedback is absolutely fine. It's welcome. We will be taking this via Menti, and then we'll be able to collate the data in the end and interpret that. It is recommended to have a second screen or a mobile phone just so you can input. It makes life a little bit easier. So just how we got here, TTAS, the current existing agreement, that expires in October 25. So in good time, we start to generate the next agreement. We started with pre-market engagement that happened in Feb through April. That was a retrospective. So we talked to the suppliers and the customers of the agreement that exists today to understand their views on it, what's good, what's bad, what's ugly. So we can start coming up with some themed feedback as to how we can improve that product. We're now doing the market engagement. That's where we are today. That's between May and June. What we're doing here is tabling the feedback that we've had from the pre-market, what we think are good solutions to address that, and then asking you some questions so we can get some more contextual feedback. And we'll be coming back out in June with the shortlist, if you will, of what these options are. We'll then move into market updates. So as we go into the background and we start developing the thing, doing all of the internal governance, cabinet office governance and all of that good stuff, we'll be coming out with updates to share with you progress so that you understand internally what the timescales are. Those will also be on the website. And then supporting all of that, we've got a transport stakeholder group. So that's a group of invested buyers. What they're doing is helping us deliver the product. And quickly moving on to transport tech and what it means to us. So it's more than just kind of sign signals on the road or rail. We see it as a combination of goods and services. People call it mobility, transport, travel, but it's our interface as people with the means to travel, and it's physical infrastructure, software, and all of the other capabilities in between. The government sees it as an unlock to economic productivity. That is true of both parties that may be present during the tenure of such a framework. So what we're doing is looking to support those policies, whatever they may be, to help connect people and places, and that helps economic productivity, balance the infrastructure, so supporting development needs of regional economies, and then supporting different regions with their specific needs because they all have independent requirements. And this is who it's made for and by. So you'll see all of the names that you recognise on here. They're all collaborating. They aren't the only voices at the table, but they are collaborating with us to help design and develop this agreement. There's membership from central government, wider public sector, subnational transport and devolved administrations. The transport technology agreement in and of itself will be very similar in scope to TTAS, plus some of the other things we'll talk about shortly. Our intention is that through Crown Commercial Services, it's the single focal point for the public sector to work with us as Crown Commercial for transport projects, whatever the technology is and whatever the requirements are, with some minor asterisks, which we'll talk about as we go through. So I just wanted to talk about the feedback that we've had so far. And this is from the pre-market engagement, looking back at TTAS to understand what the thoughts and feelings are. And they're kind of separated into two camps that you can see on screen. On one hand, on the right-hand side, we've got the agreement aspects, things about the framework and its structure itself that we can remedy, change, improve. And they are summarised by those 4 points there. And on the left-hand side, we've got what CCS do as a whole and how we can improve in that regard, which is agnostic of any framework, but it's so we can do what we do, supporting the public sector better. One of the things that we're keen to understand is how we can do that as well for suppliers. One of the bits of feedback that we had specifically with education and guidance from suppliers at the pre-market was we're very buyer-centric. We provide buyers guides and we provide all of the commercial guidance available for buyers, but we don't really educate buyers on how to get best value out of the framework, what to expect from a good procurement and so on. So that's stuff that we're working on. Each of the points therein, we've broken those down and we're looking at how we can improve. So with the scope and what you can buy from the framework, we want to better articulate that. Some of the things that you could buy are kind of reserved as a small bullet point and it's left to interpretation. We want to try and elevate those. So for suppliers of specific products that fit a niche or they're a very specific requirement, we want those buyers to be able to raise the profile of those solutions so we can launch them on the website. Buyers know where to find them. Suppliers are confident that people will know that the transport tech agreement is there for that. The structure, this is going to be one of the major topics of the call today, how we build the lotting structure. so we can provide greater clarity in how those core services are procured. The route to market, or ways to buy. So ultimately how to give flexibility from a procurement procedural point of view, but not actually stymieing innovation or creative thinking. And then the supply chain is supporting future buyers and suppliers' needs so we can get some longevity in the agreement. We don't want it to be a flash in the pan. We want it to be something consistent that bodies can return to it and tender their requirements to it. And on our side, the customer journey, we want a better pathway. So when people access our website, whether that's a buyer or a supplier, you know where to sell, buyers know where to buy. At the moment, it needs some work. Better guidance, so commercial and procurement support for agreement users, and that's helping them access the agreement, tender in a best practice way. Education is that sharing of best practice that goes from buyer and supplier. So we want to try and get insight into both camps and help them interface in the smoothest way possible. Perhaps an unrealistic dream is tenders with 0 tender queries. That would be amazing. And then from a marketing point of view, it's working with yourselves and customers to help people understand that the product is available. So hopefully that's a quick, short summary of where we are. The next section is going to be the interactive summary, and I'll pop the instructions on screen. I think in the chat, there's also a link directly to the website, but if you prefer, you can scan the QR code or go to menti.com and type in the 8-digit code there. And once you've done that, I would ask if you can just pop a heart or a thumbs up, just so we know roughly that people are successful in being able to do that. Brilliant. I can see that the numbers quickly pop up and down, so I think people are alternating between thumbs up and a heart. Unfortunately, you can only press one at a time. So moving on, I'll hand over to my colleague Steve to talk about what we're conceiving as the scope, just while we go through and work on that. I will leave, just before you jump in, Steve, the access code at the top. So for those of you, menti.com, and you can type in the access code, you can see up there, and that will help you join and be able to interact. Steve.
Yep. Thanks, Andy. As Andy mentioned, obviously the scope isn't settled. This is part of the market engagement exercise, but we have been heavily involved over the last 6 months and longer in looking at what the market is doing, where the market's going. One of the things we're really keen to do is to start to capture those products and solutions that are on the rising curve in terms of sort of utilization, rather than some of the more mature products. We'll continue to cover the scope that Transport Technology Associated Services delivers, but we want to also look at some of those new emerging solutions that are out there. We've been trawling through the delivery plans of our big transport organisations. So National Highways Control Period 7, we've been talking to National Highways around RIS3 and what that might involve. But we've also been engaging with local authorities and their local transport plans, and also engaging with subnational transport bodies, really to get a sense of what is the wider public sector doing, how are they using technology. But equally important, and part of today's session, is to engage with the supply chain to see what's happening, what's out there. We're really keen to look at innovation and how we support the uptake of new products and services. So particularly around automation and AI in transport. We're looking at things like smart ticketing. We're engaged with a number of parties that have expertise in that space. So the SAM network for smart ticketing, looking at how we can learn lessons from them, engaging with parking enforcement suppliers, looking at how technology is being deployed to support smart parking and more effective enforcement. So a whole range of areas that we've explored and want to kind of pull together and get your views on, really. So there's a list of sort of subcategories there, ranging from sort of urban mobility right through to connected infrastructure and connected asset management type solutions, predictive maintenance, etc. So as you can see, broad range of scope potentially that we want to cover, as well as delivering the goods and services we currently offer through our TTAS agreement today. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Andy? I don't know if you want me to cover that or if you want to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You please do.
So yeah, here's some examples of the technology areas that we're very interested in getting an appetite from our customers, but also insight from our suppliers in terms of the best ways to deliver these types of solutions. Very interested in end-to-end solutions that we can make available, but also the importance of chunking up where that might be appropriate for buyers. Things like smart ticketing, account-based ticketing solutions. There are providers out there that will provide that end-to-end solution, but equally, there are a number of subcategories in terms of how smart ticketing, account-based ticketing is delivered and supported. So making that available, looking at things like potential for alliancing, etc. Professional and consultancy services. It's an area that we cover today in our Transport Tech and Associated Services Agreement, but we have had a number of feedback. We have had feedback from suppliers that some of the terms and conditions are not necessarily ideal for that type of solution, that type of service. So we're taking those on board and we'll be feeding into the sort of terms and conditions discussion to make sure they're appropriate for the lots that we're delivering against. Construction services. So increasingly with technology, you can take EV charging as an example. It's a mixed procurement. There are elements of install, there's hardware solutions, there's back-end operations. So we want to be able to accommodate that sort of wider range of end-to-end solutions, and that might mean encroaching into some of the sort of construction areas that would typically be dealt with through a separate agreement in CCS, but making that available through a single commercial agreement to our customers. AI and automation, I think we've got a separate slide on that. So we're really keen to get insight from you in terms of how is the public sector procuring AI and automation. We've seen some funding going into things like smart traffic lights, traffic signals, traffic management solutions, and using AI to produce more effective control mechanisms. But there are equally other areas across transport where this is increasingly an opportunity. But how does the public sector access and buy that? I think that's something that we want to look at, and how we add value in that process. And again, the final point there was around the sort of outcome in addition to goods and services. So maybe an outcome-based approach, which doesn't presuppose the solution. It gives the buyer some insight into what the market can deliver. And the competitive flexible procedure that will be available to us under the new regulations, I mean, that could provide some really interesting ways in which we can help deliver some of the more complex transport technology solutions that the market needs.
Smashing. Thank you, Steve. So that'll move us on to the start of the questions, if you will. And it's about that scope. And as a supplier, we're interested, just as a short summary of what is your most popular product for the public sector? What is it that you sell predominantly to clients? The reason for the question, fundamentally, is just so we understand what kind of suppliers we've got on the call. We don't have a kind of segmentation, so we aren't able to pick your specific answer out of a crowd, but it just helps us with some context as to how we go forward. There's a theme.
So you've got a mixture.
Yeah, we've got a great mixture of goods and services there. That's fantastic. The desired outcome, really. What we didn't want was to find out that it was all one specific supplier segment. So it's nice that we've got a good mix and varied supplier solutions there. So no, thank you for that. So we'll I'll quickly move on to the next question, because I think that gives us a nice kind of smattering of what's there. The first thing that we ask really is, we have in scope a specific remit within transport technology and associated services, and we've spoke at brief as to what we want to incorporate. Do you think that there's anything missing from what we've discussed so far that's for consideration that you would consider to be within transport? And if you think it's okay, don't hesitate to just put it's fine.
Yeah, I was going to say everything we've got is all good, especially as the transport technology offering has evolved over the years.
Yeah.
And we always like to try, or we always try to give a little bit of wiggle room around the edges, because we recognise these things live for quite a while.
So the ease of access for SMEs, fundamentally important for us. So as we go through this, there'll be certain questions. You'll see if you're on whatever device that you're on, a lot of these have a kind of subheading. So if you are an SME, some of the questions asked, can you tell us if you are? Just so we can understand the difference in perspectives, because we understand people from the supply chain see these things differently. Just be flexible is a key one. Yeah. Smashing. Being flexible, hopefully, is a theme that you will pull out of this. It's something that we want to foster. So into the first scope questions, because those two will just get a gut feel of, do we think we're heading in the right direction scope-wise, and to get an idea of what kind of suppliers are on this call. The first thing that we wanted to really ask about is AI. It's the thing at the moment. Everybody talks about it, but we want to understand how you think as a supply chain that it would be or is incorporated. So what this question works like, there's technically 4 questions, I suppose. We've drafted a statement, and we want to understand from a supplier's perspective how much do you agree or disagree. And I think it's a sliding scale of 5 points. And what this will show is the gut feel of the room as we go across. Menti does take a short moment to, there we go, does take a short moment.
It's definitely interesting feedback. I mean, the specifications from customers shouldn't specifically ask an AI solution. But I suspect at the moment that's probably going to be the case in a lot of instances, as customers go, oh, there's a big new shiny thing. Just replace cloud from a few years ago with AI now. And they'll think that they want to be at the cutting edge, and AI is the reason for that. And AI feels like it's still a bit of a Wild West. I like to compare it to cloud. I feel like, go back 10, 15 years and everything was cloud. No one quite knew what it was. And here we are, where we are now with the various iterations, and there's a clear understanding. It feels like AI still got development to go. So that's a really, pertinent point around customers are likely to ask for AI, but the way we see as embedding it within the scope is it's more of an ancillary thing that supports an outcome, something we're doing across other parts of our tech agreements, such as tech services. The idea here isn't to create a framework that is just for AI, but if we recognise that it's a tool, and I feel that it's going to be the supply market that drives that development and maturing process of those.
No, that's really interesting feedback. So we'll go on to the next step. So this bit needs some explanation. So what we've done in the past, we being the Royal We of CCS, we've come to the table during the market engagement and said, here's a framework, do you like it or not? And we wanted to take a slightly different view on this, given how transport sits across multiple disciplines. So what we're going to present in the next few minutes is some concepts. The reason for these concepts is that they're different in some specific way to the incumbent solution, which is transport tech and associated services. So with each of these slides, please don't take away that this is what we are going to do. The reason for this is we want to understand how desirable some of these fundamental options are compared to the status quo. So the questions that we will ask after explaining each of these concepts are, do you like it or dislike it? Or do you have no strong opinion? We just ask that it's a gut feel. Don't be overly precise in your feedback, because we'll get into something a bit more specific a little later. The first, we've got 4 concepts, just for context. So this is solution focused. At the moment, transport tech and its preceding agreements were based on product. So there was a place where you can go and buy signs and signals, and a place you can buy professional services. The concept here is that's eroded to some degree, and instead that you're able to buy based on a project lifecycle, and you can buy an end-to-end service, or you can buy some design support, you can buy some implementation, some maintenance, whatever it will be. And there's a broad cut that you do a large transformation program in lot 1, where it's just a full end-to-end service. We mark ITIL lifecycle, it's ITIL-esque, that there's different stages that are prescribed. There's a professional services lot, and a lot where goods and their associated services are sold, and then a catalogue, potentially with a dynamic market to focus on those innovative solutions. That's how it's fundamentally different to TTAS, that it's service focused. And the question is just, do you dislike it, do you like it, or do you have no strong opinion in the middle? Again, the core is what your gut feeling is, just so we can understand where the market sits on these kind of things. And for context, we did a customer session this morning with contracting authorities, so it'll be interesting as we stand here now to see if there's a strong difference of opinion as we see these things coming out. Well, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. I'll quickly dip into the other. So, transport mode segmentation. At the moment, we've got a framework that tries to cater to everybody in one lot structure. The concept here is that each individual strand of transport mode, be it rail, highway, bus, and whatever others that we conceive of, have their own lot. They can focus on their own supply chain. So for those suppliers that are of a specific discipline, or they offer a specific product, you're able to enter a supply chain for that client base. There is also, at the preceding end, professional services, because we appreciate those are agnostic across all of these disciplines. And then there's an aspect of interoperability in recognition that solutions like smart ticketing need to bridge the gap between these services to some degree, and how systems can be designed to operate between each other. The idea being is that you can buy a full life cycle, full breadth of service for each of these, but to use just cold examples, lot 3 would be designed for national highways and other highway-based authorities. Lot 4 is a HS2 network rail transport for Wales rail side lot, and so on. It's based on the customer and their requirements. And again, same question.
Straight in the middle.
That's an interesting view.
Yep.
If you hover over the blue, Andy, you can bring up the number of votes. Yeah.
Almost perfect balance. That's an interesting approach. I think that's we will be asking at the end for one-to-one. So if you've got a strong opinion on that on either side, love to hear it. But we'll quickly move on to the other. So the third that we wanted to look at, it's something that's prevalent in our construction side, and in recognition of the fact that transport and construction are very similar in a lot of cases, there is an alliance approach. Now, these kind of have the sub-options for this, but primarily it's so that there is a known supply chain for the purposes of delivering transport programs, transport projects. That can be an incorporated JV alliance. So if you look at the Smart Motorway program, they've got one for that, the Smart Motorway Alliance, and that is a prescribed set of suppliers that deliver very specific goods and services. Or you can create an unincorporated alliance, so a competition via this resulting agreement would result in an alliance of parties that would deliver your project. That's supplemented by a goods and services catalogue, so that if there's commercial off-the-shelf style things that any party on the agreement can offer, standard service packages or whatever, they can be uploaded. The intent here is that in recognition of the difference between SME and kind of large-scale supply chain partners here, we would intend to also create a separate dynamic market that enables us to focus on very niche supply chains to help manage those smaller projects. Ultimately, you've got large transformation projects and smaller elements on the side. And same question again. We will be asking after these four have concluded, by the way, why some of these things are objectionable or preferable. But this is just to get a gut feel on a page for the market outlook. But thank you for that. I think that one someone skipped. Want to avoid the question entirely. But yeah, I think that's useful feedback. So this is the last one, what we're calling a mature market approach for absence of, I would say, better phrasing at the moment. Similar to what we do today, but the concept is that there's mature services that are offered throughout the supply chain for transport. There's things that have existed for a period of time. They've got strong supply chains, not much change within them, and that we would consider those mature. There's a product, service of supply, and there's a firm supply chain for that, and it's something that is standard in that sense that contracting authorities can go and source. So we would do that, and on the other side, a dynamic market for more what we would regard as immature. That's not meant to sound derogatory, but where there's evolving markets, these AI tools, new ways of working for connected, IoT for smart cities, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which has some flux in the market and variable solutions based on transport policy. We can help enable those for that supply chain on one side and leave the tried, tested and true stuff that happens day in, day out for the other. And it's that final question on that. It's quite an interesting little chart. It's quite like seeing the fight that occurs as the numbers go in.
No, I thought it was going to be overwhelmingly like from the beginning, and then it eased back a little bit. This is probably more the most sort of recognisable approach, isn't it? Very similar to what we have now with the dynamic market as well.
Smashing. Thank you for that. Moving on to the next question. We appreciate that you either like or dislike each of these options, and this is more of a preference model. So of those four things, if they were to exist in that guise, again, the specifics haven't been worked out, but if we were to have them exist in that guise, what would your preference be? It's on your phone should be a rank 1 through 4 option. Don't infer from this, by the way, that whatever the graph looks like is what we get. It's more so of a gut feel from a supplier's perspective, and we want to work through this in a one-to-one basis to understand an approach based on what's suitable for different levels of the market, SMEs, and how we can foster competition across the customer base also.
Do you want to say which one was most popular with buyers this morning? Because it's interesting.
I'll wait for a few more responses before.
Yeah.
I don't want to prejudice people's choice.
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, I didn't mean when we get to the end.
Very similar, but not quite the same. But for reference in the room, buyers this morning opted for a general preference towards transport mode segmentation. And the feedback, which we'll get onto on the very next slide, was more so because they can fish in the pond that they want to, more so than having to consider anything else that isn't of their concern, was the quite frank feedback. And that leads us on to the next question. We want to understand what the top preference was of yours and why. So as a supplier, as a reminder, there's the solution-focused end-to-end service model, transport mode segmentation, where each of the modes of transport have their own competitive space, the alliance modeling, or that mature framework and DPS approach that's similar to how we operate today. So of the response, sorry, I should have asked, can we add which of the options there are? So what the preferred option was that you selected, just so we can work with that.
There's an interesting comment about the transport focused, because what we kind of have is the buyer perspective, where they might have a specific remit in a specific area. So I'm National Highways, it says so in the title. My focus is on roads. So that's, for them, is I want to have that focus, where what is here is obviously from the supplier side is, well, I've got something that is applicable to roads, but you could also apply it in different transport areas. So it's those two perspectives, isn't it, that we're seeing, which is, I suspect, is why we've got that close but slightly flipped response.
There is some different views expressed, I think, even with suppliers, with at least one preference for transport mode segmentation. I guess it depends on the nature of what you do, and it is challenging for us, given the broad nature of topics that we're potentially covering. Some might be more aligned and directly related to roads and highways, but other solutions and suppliers will be cross-cutting.
Really great point. Thanks, Steve. Yeah.
Innovations come up a few times.
We have a bit on that in a short while about specifics and how we address innovation, so that'd be interesting. But it's one of those things that we try and combat. As you can appreciate, we've got buyers that try and make demands of how they want to procure, but we recognise that we end up burdening suppliers unnecessarily if we ended up splitting up into all the lots that any buyer would want. So it's that continuous balance for us to make sure that we're helping facilitate the market to meet, rather than being buyer centric.
It's a comment about splitting end-to-end lots to allow more participants, and I think we see some mixed comments from customers. Some of them do want direct access to suppliers that can do one component of a project. There are others who would prefer to outsource to a tier one and just get it delivered from end to end.
Yeah, it's what we're trying to get to the bottom of now is how we create an agreement that does that without wasting everybody's time. I was trying to find a nicer way to say it. We don't want suppliers to end up tendering for a lot and actually some outsourcing agreements go through and there was an expectation there was going to be a lot more projects there. Or the opposite being true, that there's a lot of project work and the outsourcing sort of scale is sat waiting for things to happen. But that's some interesting thoughts. I think when we get to the point of one-to-ones, I think it'll be interesting to unpick that and understand how we can potentially use the new mechanisms under the regulations to ameliorate some of these things. We will be discussing that in a short while. And this for me is a kind of killer question. If we were to implement some of them, again, there's the solution end-to-end, transport mode, alliance models, and mature lotting. Are there anywhere based on your business model, based on how you operate, that you just would not bid for? And what was the option and why? And the reason that we ask this question is we understand that any decision that we make has an impact on buyers and suppliers alike. So we've asked the same question to the buyers. And were there any that, you wouldn't seek to bid for if we designed it in a very specific way? That's a response I thoroughly expected. That's interesting feedback about the turnkey opportunities. So typically within these frameworks, that can be done via a consortia, where you will have a lead bidder and either key supply chain members or as a consortium, which is possible. But we understand that obviously that becomes logistically difficult because you're having to set up agreements to move forward on that basis. And we absolutely hear that feedback, that a handful of large players bid and we miss out local UK-based providers. So key parts of the partners that we're working with in developing this, they're keen on regional delivery. Transport for Greater Manchester makes no bones about it. They like to have companies in and around Manchester supporting their requirements. And it's something that we're thinking about very carefully about how we can enable that. And what we'll talk about a little bit later within the new regs on how we can do procurements might enable that to some degree. So we need to be conscious that we don't shut the door on the potential of that happening before it actually happens. But no, thank you for that. That gives us some feedback. Again, this is one of those topics that is very difficult to kind of iron through, especially on a call like this. But for those of you who want to book a one-to-one, by all means, this is something that we'd love to unpack on a very specific level. Moving on, we wanted to talk about routes to market, ways to buy. So there's kind of two sections to this. The first is going to be the type of framework or legal kind of agreement that it would be and what the options are available to us. And then the others are how we can run competitions. So within the new regs, I don't know if you've all been scurrying through advice and training or whatever might be available. But under the new regulations, there's going to be three real options that we'll be looking at. We've got an open framework, which is established in a very similar way to the frameworks that you would know today, with the caveat that they can be successive. So once within a period of time, we can reopen the framework for competition, onboard new suppliers and close it to your benefit as a supplier. What that means is if you've already tendered and you're on the framework and subject to, we assume, financial checks and so on, you don't have to rebid. You can just go on the next iteration of the framework. only new suppliers would have to rebid. So that is a time and effort saving thing. On the other side, you've got a closed framework. That is essentially what happens today. We implement an up to 4-year framework and the door gets closed, and that's the be all and end all of it. And then we've got dynamic markets. They operate very similar to dynamic purchasing systems that you'll know today. There's no grave fundamental difference. The key strength of it is that we can apply the competitive flexible procedure within the dynamic market under the new regs, but that's a separate thing. So with those kind of options in mind, we wanted to ask some questions about how we can use those. The first one isn't about either of these three things. It's a feature that can be across all of them. And a framework allows us to cap the contract maximum duration. And the question to you is, do you think we should do that? If you were to look at TTAS, some of the lots have a 7-year maximum contract term. And what we're looking for is, yes, limit them, or actually, no, the contracting authority, i.e. the customer, they should decide that. And I think it's a very one-sided view at the minute.
I guess that's interesting. The counterpoint might be, if you have a very long duration, it excludes others that weren't successful. And should we be encouraging local authorities to limit? But equally, local authorities, the customer, are central government and ALB colleagues. They have particular needs, and they may go elsewhere if we're unable to provide what they need.
And this is it. And this kind of comes into the design philosophy of how we're trying to approach the agreement. And it comes back to that flexibility. We want to give people the tools and the options to work in the way that suits them, subject to compliance and all of that other good stuff. This is a graph that is exactly reflective of the buyer side. So the market agrees in that sense. For us, it's a case of, okay, we hear it and that's what we'll do. From our perspective, it would just be a case of best practice. It's prudent for us to call back to the Cabinet Office money controls and value for money, best practice and all of that stuff. But we're a believer of the fact that the contracting authorities are wholly responsible for that rather than us telling them how to do something. So that's loud and clear. So then the question is, if the next agreement is a framework based on the descriptions given before, would you prefer an open or a closed framework? And again, open framework, subsequent competitions, and a closed framework is 4 years, closed door behind you. The supply chain is what it is.
Interesting number of closed framework options.
So within the, I would say, public sector buyer sphere, open frameworks are all the rage. It's all people want to do and want to get access to, probably because it's something new and different in the procurement space, which doesn't happen to us very often. So it's interesting to see the change in opinion. There were substantially more requests for an open framework from the customer's end than there were from the closed end. We presume that the rationale for that, and this kind of comes on to the next question, or the next couple of questions, is due to the ability that if my supplier or suppliers that I typically contract with aren't on the framework now, in X amount of years, whatever the duration will be, they might be, and we can work to smooth that over. But we can understand from the perspective of a closed framework that you've invested time, money, resource to get onto a framework, and you want to maximize the opportunity available to you to do that. So it's interesting to see that difference. Topic for a one-to-one to unpick, I feel. So reopening an open framework. I'll just explain this before people jump in if you're not aware. There's a regulatory minimum time frame in which, if there was an open framework, we would have to reopen it. That's within the first once within the first 3 years, and then every 5 years after that. Then we're proposing some options. We need to check the resources and the procedures and the processes that underpin all of this. But we can go from regulatory minimum, open it as infrequently as possible, What that means from an incumbent supplier's perspective is it will change the least. From the perspective of a interested supplier, it means that you've got the least opportunity to onboard. And then the opposite is true for the increase in frequency.
There are options to minimise the amount of effort and work required by incumbent suppliers to remain on that agreement.
I mean, for any suppliers that are on the call that also attend things like G-Cloud, this might make life much easier, because in theory, from G-Cloud X to G-Cloud Y, it'll be novated over if it's in the design of an open framework. But that's interesting feedback. The buyers, their general preference was for every other year. But regulatory minimum is fine. That still has some wiggle room in it because it's once within the first 3 years. So you could reopen once in the first year and then not again for another 5 years. But that's something that we determine through further engagement. So stepping into ways to buy, it's how our competition is actually run. So on TTAS, when you look at it, we've got requests for information, and that's market engagement, people coming out asking for information. We've got further comp, so they do a stage competition and everybody on the framework recompetes for the goods and services detail. And then we've got direct award that's available through Lot 7. It's not entirely dissimilar to what's going to be available in the new regs. They come with slightly different names. We've got direct award. We've always called it direct award. It's not formally called direct award, but it is now. So that's nice. We've got the competitive flexible procedure and we've got open procedure. So direct award is substantively the same as it is today. Competitive flexible procedure is aligned to what we would know as a restricted procedure today, where you've got a multiple tier competition and you can design multiple stages and they can be as complex and as onerous or as simple as you need to get to the result. And then finally, we've got what's called open procedure, and I've put in brackets in quotes further comp because that's ultimately the same capability as we have today. It's a single stage competition for goods and services defined in a spec, and you bid for it and go through the whole tender query stage and do all of that stuff. So the next few questions are about these procedures and how we'd like to manage them. The first one being direct award. Feedback from the pre-market engagement tells us one thing. Customers and suppliers alike love direct award. But how it's implemented is an important factor. Some CCS frameworks have it everywhere, in every lot, and it's a capability. If you look at TTAS, there's a specific use case for direct award. So this question is where you would like to see direct award implemented and how that works. I'd love to do an overlay for the buyer's graph because I think it's actually the same graph.
I think it is the same. Yes, I was about to say it's if it's not the same, it's incredibly similar.
Yeah, that pretty much exactly mirrors the want of the buyers. And again, these things are preference based, so it's almost like a point weighting system. So yeah, significant overlap in the desires of the supplier and the buyer there. So that's really interesting feedback. So
that feeds into the flexibility that we want to build in. This is about having flexibility of approach to support different routes where applicable or where appropriate, to be honest.
Absolutely. We're going in with the understanding, again, to reiterate that we've got capable buying authorities that are beholden to their own governance. So if they fit the threshold for a direct award, it's a philosophy, if you want to call it that we're not to step in the way of that. They've got through the hurdles to go through governance to achieve that. So we're going to help them facilitate it in a way that supports them. This is a bit of an off-the-wall question after the context of direct award, but actually we think it's important because it's time allocation from both parties every single time that one of these things happen. And it's with regards to requests for information and how people come out to the market and interface with the supply chain. Your general thoughts on requests for information and if there's something better we could do, whether it's a different procedure or a different approach to the same So the same thing.
Andy, I guess we do have examples where people use this to help them with developing their statement of requirements. So just to understand market capability, there are examples of RFIs and EOIs where it's used as part of the down select. So, if you don't respond and don't indicate a positive preference to proceed, then it's part of that down select for the further competition.
That's really interesting feedback, responses with other buyers. And that's something that actually I think we should think about, that if you've got a lot of RFIs going out for one subject matter, is there a way that we can work with buyers to help coordinate a kind of best practice hub so that buyers can access pre-existing information? That will save yourself some time, hopefully. But yeah, the concise set of questions would be desirable, wouldn't it? And I think that's probably a symptom of the buyer probably can't articulate very well what they actually want. So they're almost asking for that input, as Steve pertained to help develop their spec and requirements, because they probably know what they want to achieve, but not how that would be done. So they're coming out with that lens. Retainment to enable products or ideas to be reflected in the spec. That'd be good. It'd be useful to understand the feedback on open RFIs. If the respondent on that is happy to put up their hand, I can unmute and we can have a quick ask about what the intent is there. Pete's got his hand up. I don't have an unmute button. Ellie, are you able to unmute Pete, please?
Should be unmuted now, Pete.
Can you hear me okay?
Brilliant, yes.
Yep.
Yeah, it was literally, I think, almost replicating someone else's answer where it should be shared RFIs, so an open system of shared awareness, basically. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yep, absolutely.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. RFI template, I think, is an important one. So that's something in general that we're looking at doing, just improving the templates and the guidance and the capabilities there. I, as an ex-procurement person, would agree with that bottom sentiment, that we should report the info gathered as part of an RFI to future bidders, because it might be it might change the view of the client as to what the preferred solution is, and it's interesting to make sure that that's known and understood. So I would agree with that.
So you might need that request to make it public, just in case there's anything in there that is particularly specific to a customer. But yeah, we could put that on the form.
Absolutely, but I think that's really good feedback. So thank you all for that.
I was going to say, it could also be something, as we evolve our digital platforms, that becomes accessible as part of a supplier profile, maybe.
Yeah.
We can feed that up to that digital team that's working on it at the moment, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an interesting piece of feedback. I don't know if you can see that it's highlighted on my screen there. Limit what suppliers are able to ask suppliers for, because they come out looking like ITTs. And we have seen that in the past where it's almost not for information. They're testing the market before a competition to see what the feeling is. And I absolutely agree with that. And that's something that I think within our guidance and our templates and so on will make fundamentally clear that this is to help improve the amount of knowledge that you have going into an ITT and to help you shape your requirements. It's not intended to be a soft competition that's not assessed to dip your toe in the water, so to speak. So thank you for that. this comes on to the question of competitive.
Andy, you do have another hand up. I don't know if you've got time to.
Oh, sorry, Edward, I didn't see that hand come up. Same again, Ellie, would you mind unmuting Edward, please?
Hello.
Oh,
A bit random, but we're R&D, and so obviously looking for partners to play with, as it were. One of the things which would be interesting is whether it would be possible for people populating RFQs to actually potentially publish their responses and show what their capabilities are for other people to not be forced to do so, but be happy to publish them so others can see who else is playing in the game and see if they can collaborate.
whether it's a difficult one. I think whether as part of a procurement procedure, the honest answer is at the moment, I don't know. But that's a really interesting point, and it's something that we want to try and enable. One of the things that we recognise with our website, with the information that we've got, we do go back to that buyer-centric approach. And actually what we want to be able to do is work with customers who've done RFIs to understand the capabilities of the market, because at that point we'll be talking about the activity on the framework, is to then understand how we can better market the framework in the context of supplier offerings and what their capabilities are, so that suppliers have some real estate ultimately on the website. So if you're looking for X product, not only are we able to advertise that that's the framework you can buy it from, but here's a capable supply chain that can deliver it for you, and we can hopefully meet somewhere in the middle.
If you don't mind, just throw an idea up. I don't want to keep the conversation going because you're busy, and I know we're in the world now of AI, but something where an engine could actually research across the RFQs and see where the strengths and weaknesses are across the whole spectrum in a sort of safe and sensible way. That would be, potentially add value to the whole gambit of people providing their capabilities. There we go.
I agree. I'm sure the our SRM lead, Matt, who has a sprawling capability matrix on a spreadsheet, would probably very much value something like that. But yeah, absolutely. We'll take that away and speak to our digital team, as Connie says, and see what we can work out there. That'd be very useful. Thank you for that. So sorry, I skipped ahead on this question and didn't really preface it. So what we're looking at here is a competitive flexible procedure, a multi-stage procedure that enables you to design your own competition ultimately within the new regulations. Just so I can explain the phraseology, I put open market, as in we don't prescribe anything for the customer, the contracting authority to do. They get to write their own procedures and operate in that way, and in compliance with the regulations is wholly their thing. The alternative is the other side of the coin, a prescriptive set of procedures. So when we enter the framework, there is a known set of procedures that the client can use. They'll be predefined and understood, so you as a supplier would understand the nature of the competition when you see the procedure come out. Or there's somewhere in between where the client can do what they like in the design of that, but what we will do is work with suppliers, work with customers to create what is approaching best practice for a given tender type. So if you're doing pilot, test, trial, and then procurement of the resulting solution, that's going to look very different to a down select for back office software and then integration into your systems, right? But if we can create journeys to help contracting authorities access that procedure and deliver that in a best practice way, it creates some standardization for you, and it helps them navigate procurement a little easier through our framework. And it's just the approach that we take for that. But it's interesting that you've asked for prescription of the procedures. That's interesting. Any thoughts?
Andy, I don't know whether it's worth picking up on the best practice hubs. Not directly relevant here, but I know we've got a number of EV charging suppliers on the call today. And obviously we're working with Nevis Procurement Forum, for example, to support local authorities in EV charging. There are other organisations which have particular expertise in a particular field. For example, Innovate UK and their what was called the SBRI programme, the supporting pre-commercial procurement, the R&D and trial piece, I think they would be quite keen to develop some guidance and routes. And I guess it's whether you leave that as a sort of optional route which might feed into the customer defined procurements, or whether we set them out up front and say, actually, through this agreement, we'll be able to cover off a number of predefined requirements. So I think maybe there's some overlap between sort of 2 and 3, and some value between that. But yeah, no, interesting feedback.
Yeah, thank you. On to the next one. So Steve's already remarked on down selection and how some authorities have used a request for information, almost like an expression of interest for that. And down selection typically is used to go from a pool of X suppliers down to Y, whatever that constriction looks like. And these are another set of statements, the last one being a bit of a cynical personal ask to see if that's what your impression of this stuff is. But it's whether you agree or disagree with a statement made as to how down select should be used to shorten the supply chain that can bid for the required. We find that these things are used quite, I would say, variably in their quality, maybe, if it's not unfair to say, where in some cases people want to go and take 50 incumbents from the supply chain and quickly, rapidly get down to 5 that they actually want to run a competition with. And in some cases, if you've got a lot like TTAS and you've got 30 suppliers of varying capabilities, asking a question in a 2-stage competition of, are you actually capable of supplying this specific thing that I need, is a very useful way to save time in the procurement. But we just want to understand the thoughts and feelings of the supply chain as to how these sit. That mirrors the sentiments of the buyers to some degree, but actually let's reserve it for complex multi-stage procurements to help narrow down competition if there's a lot of different capabilities and a lot in a standardized way. They weren't asked the question at the bottom, only the suppliers were asked that, because it feels like finger pointing if we ask the buyers. But we just wanted to get the personal feelings of suppliers who have been part of this process, whether that's what it feels like when these things happen. Any thoughts, Steve, Colin?
Interesting one about the generic lot structure. Feeding back into the concepts around the structure. Where we try and balance. We can't. The lots tend to lend themselves to the scope of something or the supplier base for something. So, having been working on tech services for, it has, TS3 has 100 plus suppliers per lot. One of the things there is about down select, because it's probably a similar thing where you've got quite broad lots, but real variety of supplier capability, everything from, in that space, you've got the system integrators and SMEs. So one of the things they're looking at is a down select process there. The challenge there is about how to implement it and ensure the capability and responses are correct, as it were. So I think that is a useful tool. It's about providing that tool set, RFI down select, where we can, to just create that flexibility for the buyers. And I also think this is probably, with the competitive flexible, I think this is something that for buyers who want to go into that competitive flexible, the guidance is very kind of specific around pre-market engagement and these sort of elements, which maybe in the traditional further competition might have just been skipped over as quickly as possible to get to ITT and evaluation. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this starts come to the fore more under the new regs. There's definitely a push towards more of a further competition, competitive, flexible offering rather than direct award. So I think these sort of elements are something that we we need to consider and figure out how we could actually implement something like that.
I agree. And that kind of the similar question to down select, but this is a far more permanent feature in the sense of a framework, is we can, within a procurement, limit the amount of suppliers in any given lot. We like to do that sparingly, but we wanted to get your opinion as a supplier. When is that best used? If you're just against it, feel free to put that in general. But we'd love to understand why that's the feeling. And for reference, for those who, if I wasn't that clear, if you were to go out for a lot like we've done today for transport professional services, which is lot 1 of TTAS, in theory, we could have limited that to 5 suppliers and only the top 5 scoring suppliers are admitted. That's just an example. I'm not saying we're going to do 5 suppliers on a lot.
No, but it is used in some cases. You know, when we can look back to our tech products and associated services too, where we had a lot that was a catch-all for goods, services, everything. It was very much a lot that resellers and OEMs would be able to deliver. And, you know, again, trying to balance the feedback from the buyers that might be put off an agreement just by the supplier numbers, even though the amount of responses would be reduced by capability assessment and RFI, etc. It's that initial perceived number of suppliers. And, you know, the way we combat that is we could restrict the suppliers. We could have more lots, but then if we put more lots, if you're a supplier that wants to bid across multiple lots, it's more effort. So it's trying to navigate that path of having a diverse, capable supplier base, but one that doesn't look too erroneous for a buyer. And that's where these tools, I think, need to come into the fore a little bit more. I think limiting suppliers, it depends on the specialism and maturity of the specific area. It's not something we tend to do without considerable market research and engagement. And there's an impact on reopening the framework going forward as well.
Yeah, and I think the general trend of feedback is don't artificially limit the amount of suppliers. Actually, just set a quality threshold that needs to be surmounted.
Which we do anyway. It's all part of the big process, is a quality threshold that takes everything into account.
Yeah, and I think that surmises it. You know, if as a supplier you're against it, I think there's a fair justification that if you pass the quality threshold, there's that feeling that you've got as much right to reopen for the competition as anyone else. And I can imagine, I've not bid for a public sector framework in that sense, but I can imagine it stings if you meet all of the thresholds, but for whatever reason you still lose. That must be incredibly frustrating, especially with the time investment. So that's interesting feedback, and it's something that I've spoken to the project leads looking at frameworks internally about as well, as to how they're navigating that approach. So thank you for that. The next set of questions is about dynamic markets. So dynamic purchasing system, as was in old language. I'm sure you're all familiar to some degree with them. The common critique that we get of frameworks is it places barriers for inclusion with SMEs and the sourcing of innovative new technologies. You can do innovation through a framework, but if there's a new product out there being tested, trialed and developed by a customer, or that it's new to a given market, the ability to enter that market is difficult. One of the things that we want to make sure of is if we do a dynamic market, and if we do a dynamic market, we want it to focus on capabilities that are within the dynamic market for a reason, rather than just take transport tech and then throw everything of transport tech into a dynamic market just so we're covered. We want to understand specific areas of the market that are actually just better suited to that mechanism than perhaps the framework. And that was hence the concept of the mature framework lot plus a DPS, because we recognise some of these things can be handled differently. So the next set of questions are really about a DPS. And the first one is a bit of a yes-no question, I suppose. But if you've got something innovative, do you just struggle to sell that with the mechanisms that we've got? Whether that's CCS or another PBO or whatever it might be, do you have difficulty getting those things out Yes.
I was going to say, if you could put why. We'll evolve this question. And why, yeah.
So on the ask of the respondent with the development with a scope of works, statement of works, I presume that pertains to. Can I ask for a little bit more information on that if you're happy to discuss that? Yeah, that's a really interesting bit of feedback on the risk-averse nature of public sector. So it's one of the things that we're trying to grapple with, that it's almost like people want the innovation from the micro company that's developed something new, and they don't know whether the solution is perfect for their means and they need to develop it, but they also want none of the associated risk with accepting those solutions. And that's something that we're trying to support the working through. This is why it kind of sits within a dynamic marketplace in a slightly more elegant way than perhaps a framework. But yeah, it's difficult from the point of view when you've got something that's conceivably fine, but there is a perceived risk with the adoption of the technology, so it shuts down.
Andy, I guess there may be a similar challenge in terms of public sector organisations struggling to buy innovation, particularly innovation that they may have invested in, because through the current process, there's the pre-market funding and R&D that they're involved in, and then there's a separate commercial activity to procure, and that doesn't necessarily mean they get what they've funded and developed, which for them can be frustrating. With a new competitive flexible procedure, there may be that option for us to incorporate that development test element, trialing in maybe a small area and then scaling up within a single contract, which has advantages for some of our public sector customers.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it aligns similarly to this problem, that actually in some cases people go out to try and buy innovation. And this goes back to the slide right at the start when we talk about scope inclusions and we talk about outcomes. And actually we want buyers to present problems to be solved to the market. And one of the things that we're trying to foster when we've got this done, and you'll see this in the later slides at the end, is that we're trying to establish a buyers group. And that'll be a forum where ultimately we can have them present problems, and we want to be able to socialize those with the incumbent suppliers on our agreements, plural, whatever they might be, so that we can help arrive at a better conclusion rather than typically what would be the obvious solution to most people just being written in. Proof of concept being very difficult is another one. So the competitive flexible procedure, a specific part of the training that was delivered by the Cabinet Office in those modules does stipulate that the old design competition, innovation partnership, and also all of those procedures have been incorporated into competitive flexible, which gives us the ability, if we went back to your feedback on prescribing a route that we could procure, we could work with you as a supply chain to help describe or prescribe, to use the word, a procedure for a competitive flexible that helps people go through proof of concept. And if it ends up meeting their benchmark criteria, whatever they may be, they can go on to procure the good or service or whatever it is out the outturn. So that could be very useful. Unfortunately, that also comes into speed of uptake due to procurement due process, and there's that balancing scale there. But for us, it's about making sure that if there's barriers, a lot of these things I think are habitual or procedural, and we want to be in a position where we actually help people remove those barriers, and we help people actually just get closer to the solutions that they're after. And this kind of takes us on to the next one. So this one comes in, we've spoke about innovation, we've spoke about new scope inclusion and all else. when you actually think about it, we've come in today to talk about transport tech. What would you call it if you could call it anything that you'd want?
Or if just calling it transport tech works, just no, not TTAS. We're not calling it TTAS. we have explicit instructions. We're not calling it traffic management technology 3 or 4 either.
I think the other parts of CCS would be quite upset if we just called it technology.
Or transport. Transport solutions is quite cool. Transport tech solutions, intelligent transport tech solutions. Oh my God, no. Then that would like an acronym. UK. Yeah, I think we're allowed to go. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Slight copyright infringement there, Steve.
But I think your point, as you've seen from the scope, it is potentially a broadening of scope from what was provided for under TTAS, starting to encroach in some of those sort of infrastructure deployment type solutions, as well as the technology products and the back-end operation. So we are sort of encroaching into what you might typically think as other areas of CCS, so other commercial agreements that you might typically go to currently. We're looking to make that available through a transport solutions, technology solutions focused agreement.
And that's the kicker. So the context of this question, as silly as it sounds, we were reasonably confident with transport tech. And then we spoke to the Home Office, and they remarked that actually a lot of the technologies that we have on transport tech, your ANPR, your enforcement and compliance technologies and so on, that they use, they didn't know were available because they didn't think to check a transport agreement for those, because they just see them as enforcement, compliance and security. And then we spoke to DEFRA, and they were talking about environmental weather stations and all of that stuff. And they said, well, we wouldn't look at a transport agreement to go and find those technologies because to us it's environmental systems. And we've found out that there's this kind of cross-sector approach that transport have, where it kind of touches a bit of everything in some way. So National Highways are deploying weather sensors. They supply information back to the Met Office and DEFRA and so on. But DEFRA are on their own estate, but they don't look for the transport agreement because they don't see it as transport. And it's how we articulate it as a provision for the market, really, to approach solutions that are transport focused and environmentally focused and security and compliance and enforcement focused, and how we pull that together into something that's meaningful and shorthand. And it's actually trickier than you think.
Good luck. Good luck, Andy.
Yeah, I wish it'd be as simple as end user devices. Life would be a lot easier, laptops. But no, that's interesting. We'll take that away. So back to the dynamic market question. We're considering, so if we had a dynamic market for innovation, it might stretch beyond the remit of transport tech for consideration of what we've got today. We've got VSIS, Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Solutions. We've got Spark, which is like an innovation incubator style dynamic market. And we're also looking from the perspective of transport, that the buying group that we've got, those customer stakeholders that we showed you at the start, they're very interested in being able to take innovation from, using the comment from before, the leading edge. So it's commercialization of something that's been proven. How do we then get that in a vehicle that allows people to procure it? And we're considering all of those things that we've got within tech services, which is our category within CCS, and how we can better facilitate the procurement of innovation in general with a transport lens for the purpose of this call. But it's interesting that it's, I'll be quite honest, the buyers showed no strong desire for yes, we would, no, we wouldn't. It was kind of a, just help us buy innovation. So it's interesting that there's a view to that, but we are interested in the theme of getting innovation to market. So thank you for that. Now this bit, please try not to fall asleep. We hope this is more interesting than the words, terms and conditions usually evoke in people. Principally, we just want to ask you some quick questions on the form of contract. So for some context, it's the nuts and bolts below that makes all of the thing tick. CCS, we own the intellectual property rights for the public sector contract. We're redeveloping that as an organisation to fit the new regulations and all the new means and requirements. It is the default option. So it is presupposed by our policy and procurement teams that we will use the public sector contract unless there is a solid case for change. So if there is one, we need to know, because if there's not one, unfortunately, within those groups, silence means acceptability of PSC. So we really, really want your feedback on this. So if you're kind of on the fence, even expressing your view will help us give that critical lens. When we did the pre-market, when we spoke to suppliers, when we spoke to customers, there were these kind of key things that came out. The terms and conditions that sit around primes and subcontractors, key subcontractors and how they work, IPR and liability, ever-burning topics. I don't think there's an agreement that goes by that doesn't have some firm feedback on those two things. Statements of work and how they sit within the terms and conditions. So how statements made at procurement end up in a statement of work, end up enforceable from a KPI SLA point of view. Termination for convenience. We understand that investment made in a service, having termination for convenience is difficult as a supplier. DDAP playbook. So how, as a tech agreement, this interfaces with those mechanisms within and the contracting structures, the finance mechanisms and all that stuff. There's been a call for simple terms for low value call off, short form contracts for small, more transactional requirements. If someone needs to buy cabling for something for roadside use, it shouldn't be a full blown competition of hundreds of pages of terms and conditions. It should be quite succinct. And then the last thing is the SME ecosystem and how we can help support that market as per Gov policy. But these questions all pertain to the terms and conditions, and we've kind of spoke about scope and we spoke about what we want to include with construction and with professional services and so on. And I suppose it's an open question from your perspective as to what you think the most appropriate contract form would be, whether it's public sector, new engineering contract, the framework agreement contract, which is how we orchestrate alliances, and then model services contract as well. And then there's another option. That's quite a lot of feedback for other / it depends. Would someone mind putting the hand up and just articulating what was meant by that? So is there another form of contract, or does it just depend? There's multiple uses and you might want to use one for some circumstances and one for the other. Alistair, Ellie, if you could mute Alistair, please.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, basically, as an SME, we're looking for the lowest level of entry possible. So some of the requirements actually have a lot of work involved to go through. So really looking for simplification wherever possible.
Okay. So is that, do you see that the 4 models of contract there are not the best use case for this?
It's difficult because of the huge scope of goods and services that you're dealing with. But I think wherever possible, trying to simplify the forms of contract will obviously make everyone's life easier from both a purchaser or a supplier. To be honest, I don't know what the requirements of the public sector contract are, but you know, on occasion, the requirements can be quite onerous. So as I say, as an SME, it would be good to have it as simple as possible.
Wrong. So that's one of those things that we want to look at is short form versions. So when it comes to a secondary competition or further comp or competitive flexible, whatever it will be, that there is a simpler form of contract. So the framework contract is, for the most part, what it is. But when it comes to the actual competition, the contract that you would have between a contracting authority and yourself, we're keen to make that as simple as possible, as you say. So short form contracts, even if it comes down to better guidance or after award support and so on, that'd be valuable. But thank you for the feedback. I'm keen to understand more on the "it depends" category. There's a not insignificant amount there. Well, actually, I'm asking you for something that comes up in this question. So for the people who chose other/it depends, we'd be interested to know if you chose which model you chose and then what it is you supply, because there might be a skew towards PSC being great for IT, but not so great for whatever it is that you deliver. So if you did pick the other/it depends view, I'd really value the input as to why not the other models. I knew this would happen when we got to T's and C's.
It takes so much time to write out, that's why.
Yeah. So the alliancing model would be a preference, and then design consultant. Okay. Yeah, we've heard that with regards to these kind of contracts. One of the next question, funnily enough, is we're really interested in being able to bridge the gap. So if there's the opportunity with you to do a deep dive when you chose the other for the specific things that you offer, if it ends up being PSC, one of the things we were tasking our policy team with is here is some very specific feedback, some issues with PSC, and we need to be able to surmount them, and then how we can manage that. Yeah, and that's a big one. So termination for convenience, it's a difficult one to go over because in some cases it's wanted by buyers. I think one of the key problems it has is it's not fundamentally clear on, let's say, settling the books when it comes to that. So in theory, it looks like we can just, I'm talking public sector liberally, but we can just walk away from the contract. But there are actually very strict commercial calculations onto what you actually owe the supplier based on investment made into the contract and so on that I don't think are articulated very well. And I understand completely that it's a risk profile, especially at the board of a lot of organisations, and we've heard that. So we are taking that feedback, hence why it appears on that slide. T's and C's appropriate for what's being purchased. We need to have various options. We heard that in the pre-market. So fitness for purpose, when it pertains to consultancy, it's not really applicable. So we need to make sure that the language is aligned. And like you say, it should be tailorable depending on type. And we want to get to a point where we've got sufficient feedback to give to our policy colleagues that we can start addressing these problems specifically. Because I certainly don't want to stand here today and say, yeah, we'll solve all of those problems, and then it lands and it's standard PSC, because that's not really going to solve any of these barriers. So I'd value if you've got clear-cut examples and then thoughts on how we can surmount the problem that we can together pose to the policy team. I'd love to be able to bring those things to the table. The next question, because it's the default, it's not necessarily a preference of ours, but because it is seen as the default option, that kind of goes into what we were just, or what I was just talking about. We want to know that if your preference was for something else, how do we make it bridge the gap, that it's a form of contract that's valid for what it is that you supply? It's a very difficult question to answer on a survey, I appreciate. But if there's any feedback on that, or you'd want a one-to-one, happy to just write to one-to-one and then book one at the end, and then we'll be able to unpack it, because it's not really something you'd be able to articulate in 200 characters, I wouldn't have thought.
And we have had customers who've set out quite detailed provisions in within their statement of requirements and special terms to clarify exactly how certain provisions in the core public sector contract terms apply.
And I agree with that, yeah. And the irony is, to be honest with you, that is basically available today. I think that the issue is that the articulation of how to do that in the best possible way whilst being compliant with the framework is, I'm trying to be polite, but it doesn't really exist. It's a very rare thing to find across any kind of PBO frameworks. So special terms can be incorporated and modifications to terms in some cases can be made. But I want to, I do want to broach the conversation as to what is acceptable to be changed, being open for discussion, rather than just, you know, there is a KPI and it is, and you can modify the amount of days that you've got to respond. Understanding how to better do that would be good. Yeah, 100% agree on the schedules. There is a lot of them. And this comes into the short form content. How do you design a contract where you use as few schedules as possible? So TPAS 2 that was launched in, November, I think it was last year now. Realistically, the simplified form of contract in that is the minimum acceptable amount of schedules that apply to the order form in one place. And then we sought to understand the use case for that. And it's something that we want to explore for this as well. Because in doing so, we're able to narrow it down, that requirement. And I think the guidance to not use all, in some cases, we say they're mandatory or they're not, and this is kind of what it does. But we don't go that next step of explaining why it's valuable, or in some cases, in context of their procurement, not valuable to apply. So I think that's something that we can take away and work on. Yeah, it's... And this is 100% it. This goes back to the guidance point. To be honest, the ask from the buyers wasn't that we don't understand it. Can you give us some better guidance? The specific ask was, why are you giving us all these schedules? And it's actually to help them design a procurement or a contract that works for them. But unfortunately, the perception is met that these are all applicable. So, yeah, being able to work for those would be phenomenal. Wow, 44 documents. Yeah, I agree. That needs remedying. I think I don't understand here and solutionise is the honest answer, but I think that's a problem. And it's definitely something that we want to reduce. I'll check with policy on that last point. Because I think, as I say, in some cases, the framework agreement between us and the supplier is for the framework and that the joint schedules will apply. The call-off schedules are, in theory, absolutely relevant to the buyer's requirement. Computer readable templates, yeah, that's a good point. We'll pick up on that. Yeah, ITT accessibility if the PQQ was missed. So in theory, without potentially landing someone in hot water, if they went out with an expression of interest, it is for supplier deselection. So in theory, you should be invited regardless. now competitive flexible when it comes to down select and all of these other tools does change the nature of that. One of the things that we're keen to do, though, is for opportunities that are going through the framework, that we're able to market them on behalf of the buyer, so we can raise the profile with the supply chain. How we do that, we haven't quite got towards yet. But one of the things that we're keen on doing is making sure that there's better visibility of what's coming through the framework, so that as suppliers, you can anticipate that and react to it, rather than you log into your e-tendering solution one day and there's just something that's sat there that you weren't aware of at all. Yeah, I'd agree with that sentiment, actually. If the terms that deviate from the framework agreement, or at least change the nature of it, and the rest of it is standard, I would agree. In some cases, some of these schedules, if they're applicable, they're not editable. They just apply. And that's like data protection and stuff like that. It just is. And you just put some, your data protection officer's name in it. You probably don't need that as part of your tender pack. You just need to be told that it's going to apply. And the manner in which it does, because you've already got the documents. So that's a fair point. And I think that comes down to the procurement officer. It's very difficult for us to control, but it's something that we can definitely get into guidance. And like you say, that on the portal itself, you don't have to trough through a document to find all of these prescriptive rules. Being able to see that elevated as to how to bid would be very useful. And this kind of pulls on to the last one. So what schedules and terms deliver value? So we've noted that from some of the feedback, actually, it does add complexity and it does add complications, but which is the opposite? So which of the schedules that you think are actually vital that they be applied because they're a good protection or value add for you or the buyer? Yeah. I was expecting IPR to appear on there at some interval.
Someone's going to say it now.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd be surprised if someone doesn't.
I've invited the vampire in.
It's a very different question, I guess, for a supplier to consider than a buyer. A buyer might be looking for social value. What are you going to do for the local environment through this contract? From a supplier, as you say, it's probably IPR. Ensure that you can make use of some of the data that you capture during the work that you're delivering. Maybe there's added value you can get through different sources.
Gain share mechanisms are always. I assume that share of savings pertains to gain share, because there's no greater incentive than being more efficient than actually getting some in your back pocket. Flow down subcontractor, is that sort of concurrent terms? So you have essentially the same terms as the prime. You'll have to forgive my ask of the acronym for CSI. I'm assuming it's not crime scene investigation, but mine's drawing a blank.
Forensic investigation of contract.
Indexation is a really interesting one. And we don't. I don't have an answer to this, but it's an interesting topic. The indexation on CPI, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that the sector that you are in has seen the same degree of inflation as CPI. It's a strange benchmark. So what we saw over COVID was some markets impacted dramatically, and that raised the average CPI level, and that went into that basket of goods. So everybody got to index on the basis of a market that wasn't affected. It was an interesting thing that came out of government commercial. But then there's also the question of when it comes to an open framework, if you were to reopen an open framework, do the suppliers that are incumbent get to index their rates, or do they get to retender their rates? And that's one of the procedures that we need to iron out and understand, because we need an answer on that. Because typically, if you got to the end of the year and you apply for indexation, but it happens to reopen the framework, are you expected to rebid, or do you just keep your rates in index? And that's a really interesting thing that we need to pick up on.
CSI might be to do with customer satisfaction index, possibly.
Commercially
I
sensitive.
I don't think the chat function's available to most of our attendees, so might have to
It's
put your hand up.
commercially sensitive information. Someone put, I'm keeping on the Q&A, so thank
Cool.
you for that. And indexation, yes, it is something we can, we can draw on the work that's been done on T+2 in regards to the goods. In tech services, there was indexation from year 3 in contracts. So yeah, this isn't something specific to transport tech. So we can take a lead, but also feedback in terms of, what other agreements are doing.
I've just noticed from the Q&A, sorry if we've missed this, Edward, that earlier you mentioned that tier 1 contractors might compete to own the initial procurement with CCS, with us, CCS prescribing the subcontracting spec. That's an interesting view. So one of the things that we were looking at was when it comes to value, whether it's social value or value for money and so on, do you incentivize people on the framework to subcontract through SME supply chains and so on, so you can improve the accessibility to SMEs if there was inclusion of a framework vehicle that naturally would preclude the access for SMEs. So there's mechanisms around it that we might be able to look at. But yeah, I think that also ties into some of these things when it comes to the new transparency. Yeah, I've just seen second vote for annual price indexation. And that's it. We need to look at these mechanics. So getting this feedback's vital. I think from a transparency point as well, a lot of the procurements and so on, so looking at the commercially sensitive information, there's a lot more transparency that's going to happen with regards to uploading of contracts onto a platform that the Cabinet Office own and so on. So I think the stuff that is truly commercially sensitive, rather than I just don't want people to see it, I think is really important to get right, especially if it pertains to intellectual property or something that really shouldn't be out there, whether it's classified as secret or whatever it might be. So that's an important view. So we're nearing the end, so this will move on to the closing thoughts and steps. I know we asked very similar question at the start, but we just wanted to reiterate now we've gone through the whole thing. Is there anything else that you want to provide insight into on the development? Is there anything that you feel like we haven't spoke about, thought about, that we can start the conversation on? If you think we've covered it, please add that so we don't fear that we've lost you all. Simple and consistent is something that I personally love, so that's what we're aiming at. Brilliant. On the subject of that comment on one-to-one, literally the next question, it's going to give you a short form on your mobile or your screen, whatever it is that you're using, and then we'll go from there. I feel like that regulated concession contract question was written by someone close to me, but unfortunately not. No. So new PPA 23 through a framework or dynamic market, a above threshold concession cannot be procured through this framework, or indeed any, under the new regulations. There are models that you can go for. So a strict concession, transfer of risk, but right to exploit. Purebred concession, there is a firm answer of no, but that doesn't mean that CCS can't support. So there are other mechanisms that we are looking at to redress that. As soon as it came out in the regs, it's a discussion we're having internally. Some of these things, Steve's doing a lot of work in this from the strategy side about services. So they're zero value service provisions. I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question. You're probably thinking, oh God, what's going on? But one of the things that I would implore is please have a one-to-one to us, because we've been kind of bannerman for this internally, saying that this is potentially a problem because of the nature of EVI, which I presume this is probably about. We want to make sure that policy have heard the feedback. So whoever's left that comment about concession contracts, please book a one-to-one, and we want to be able to take that forward. Implications with the new Procurement Act. That's something that come June, which we'll talk about in a second. Something come June in a face-to-face that we'll be able to unpack a little bit more. We'll know a little bit more based on the development of other frameworks in CCS. But also we'll be able to talk more specifically because we'll be closer to the final approach that we're going to take. And just so I understand the question, clarify DevOps company can get a place on this framework. I think yes. So we're not looking for just suppliers that are thoroughbred transport suppliers. In some cases, actually, a lot of the things that happen in transport, acquisition of data is something that is no longer a source from a transport device. It's a source from a bunch of connected devices. And being able to access that is potentially very useful. But to answer more specifically, it'd be really good to have a one-to-one so that we can move forward with that.
Yeah, I was going to say for that question as well, just keep an eye on its engagement, when the specs released, when our structure's released, all those elements. And then it's obviously a kind of internal decision to decide whether you want to bid for it. If we do decide to go with the dynamic market as well, there's potential options around that. So I would say that's not really an answer that we can provide. It's really going to be down to yourself, but just keep engaging, keep attending these, have one-to-ones with us, and then you get a sense of whether that is appropriate for your organisation.
Just a quick.
I was going to answer the Basware question. Shall I take that? For the time
you do
being,
Basware, I'll talk about.
Okay. So for the time being, we will continue to use Basware. There is a roadmap of review and consolidation of the digital platforms across CCS, but I'm sure you can understand with the complexity of what we do, they take time. So for the moment, yes, it is Basware, but we are looking and we want feedback on how we can improve the guidance, and we're also putting more pressure on Basware themselves in terms of how they interact with us. So we've got better sight of any potential changes, etc. they make. So stick with us. But personally, these are 8-year agreements. They're going to potentially start running under the new regs. So fingers crossed at some point we will move away from Basware. Over to you, Steve.
Yeah. I was just going to comment on the duplication point. We are very, very conscious of that, and it's burdensome for suppliers and provides uncertainty to our customers if they're unsure where to go. I think we've seen quite a few transport solutions delivered through G-Cloud, and whilst that might be advantageous, there are good reasons why we can deliver more benefit through a transport-facing commercial agreement in that space. There are also going to be, given the nature of transport and some of the solutions that we're talking about, there will be other applications for the goods and services you provide outside of transport. It might be health focus, it might be an education focus. But clearly where it has a transport link, our preference, I think, is to be able to deliver those types of solutions through this agreement. Example is on the EV charging space at the moment. There's quite a lot of innovation around mobile EV charging, and organisations, customers looking for things like energy storage solutions or clean energy generation specifically related to off-grid EV charging. Now they can go to an energy agreement and get energy storage. They can go to an energy agreement and get energy generation device. But where this is linked in with EV charging, we're looking to direct people through to this agreement. Similarly, with telematics, there's a bit of duplication there. We've got a telematics agreement, but actually, if you're a fleet manager and you're buying fleet vehicles and you want the hardware installed in the vehicle, it makes sense to do that through the telematics and the fleet team agreements. If you're interested in wider telematics to support analysis of traffic flows or other data, then the services that we can provide through this agreement might be more relevant. Sorry, Connie, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to carry on with that point. So we are aware about the duplications within tech. We do have a rationalisation program that we're still formulating in terms of how we aim to reduce the duplication. There's a comment about that and a comment about why would buyers choose to procure this framework over others. What we're aiming to do here is to kind of change the approach, especially within our tech category, that actually we recognise that we are or our agreements have been set up in a more vertical aspect. Here's a bit of cloud and hosting, there's a bit of software, here's some services and some cyber. What we're trying to do here is do something that cuts across the horizontals and recognise that what we want to build here is an area that's more of a one-stop shop. So if I want to come and procure multiple elements, then that might include some software that is more admin-based and transport-based, then we've got the supplier and the capability to do that. It's all about creating that ease of selling for yourselves as suppliers and ease of buying from the other side for the buyers. So it's a slight change in mindset, but it's just basically about how we can add more value through our agreements rather than just building multiple ones to go after chunks of the public sector and have a bit more of a strategic view on that.
No, absolutely. So supply registration service, DPS.
Tony, aware of that? Yeah, we've got, I hear that from us because I look after cyber as well. The cyber DPS team, we've got them working on it at the moment. We really recognise that. We're trying to build the case. So again, if you want a one-to-one, if you really want to understand the challenges you've had, please contact us. Sorry, Andy, I only want to jump in because, I've heard that one a few times. Working on it.
Far simpler question. Will this recording and the slides be shared with us? Yes. Fine. Because of Menti, we can't download the slides as the questions, but you'll have the recording. What we might be able to do is just put it as a PowerPoint and then you can see what question was asked. One of the things that we're doing with the feedback, which we'll get onto in a second, there was one question there. Do you think the Procurement Act is causing a slowdown of purchasing cycles presently within the public sector? Really interesting question. And this is coming from someone who doesn't have insider information. But I think if you look at the context of three things, there is a looming election cycle. And on that basis, because of PERDA, you usually have people quite nervous. Would you start a really big transformational policy-based approach with the potential that the policy that you're aligning it to might not be the policy in 6 months' time by the time you actually get to market? Maybe not. There's a lot of questions still to address about the Procurement Act. The practicalities of it, the actual procedural elements of it is something that, while we remain confident about, we don't know the answers to all of this stuff yet. So in some cases, if you know that you've got a renewal coming up in your contract in the next 8 months and you know that it's under the new regs, you probably are a little bit more apprehensive than you would typically be. And I think in combination, I'll be quite frank, is economically so many places are cash strapped right now that you might have just seen a natural slowdown in the procurement cycle as people start to pick and choose their investments. If you look at a city like Birmingham, which quite frankly is broke, I live there, it's not going great. So they're literally having to pick and choose what services they go out for procurement. So what you might have naturally expected to see might be on a bit of a slowdown.
Andy, I'm conscious of time. Do we want to move on to
yes,
the...
we've only got a minute left. Interoperability, really big and important for us. We absolutely want to tackle that, but we'll pick up on that point. This is the one-to-one slide. If you could quickly pen in your details, if you don't mind. Unfortunately, I don't see the actual details, but I think it's name, email, a date in the diary that suits you if you've got access to that. If not, we can have a quick discussion and find a suitable date. And then I think there's some tick boxes with some topics that you consider particularly important to yourself, just so we can, come in wise more so and know how to support you. Now, what I don't see is if people do actually sign up.
Maybe they could do a thumbs up. There we go. Okay, see? Give it
Bro, I don't know if this 5 means the amount that have, or if it. I don't know.
We're testing something new, so we'll find out. If not,
Yeah.
you can reach out, and our contact details will be at the end. Or we'll do a follow-up survey as well. So there's multiple avenues for booking a one-to-one.
I was seeing if I had any settings that would allow me to. Come on. So timelines. So when we're looking at the delivery timeline, where we're at today, we're in between agreement design and launch prep. So these are based on annual years, not fiscal years. So Q2, we're in agreement design. We're trying to understand exactly what the customer needs, what the desires of the supplier are. In Q3, Q4, we're going to agree the structure, scope, start developing the terms and conditions, and build out the procurement. So we understand the logistics of that. That aligns with the timescales where we're going to be doing the market updates to keep you abreast of what's happening. We're still going to be having one-to-ones. We can still talk to you. It's not a closed door. When we get to spring 25, we're going to go out with ITT publish prep. And what that means is between the actual agreement internally through governance to launch the thing, and when it goes live when the ITT goes live in spring, we're doing a lot of work to help flesh the whole thing out, create all the guidance. And then between spring and autumn, loosely April, October, but they're not cast in stone, but loosely April, October, that's going to be the procurement window, and it will go live, we're anticipating sometime around October 25. And then the live agreement will stand at that point. And you can see with the little infographic at the bottom how TMT2 has grown in scope a little bit, transport tech has, and it kind of overlaps with vehicle charging infrastructure, which is, I think, Steve addressed that in the Q&A that's in the Zoom chat. And then there's the final slide before we say thank you. We're going to take all of this feedback. It is going to be part of the thinking that we incorporate. We're going to come back to the market in June. If you search for Tech UK and look for their face-to-face engagement event, that's going to be hosted in London. We're looking at hosting another with some other partners. So there'll be one in North. So for those of you who are geographically difficult to get into London, especially when the trains only operate half the time, we'll have something geographically located elsewhere. I know it says sign up here, clunky, but what we can do, if someone doesn't mind, quickly drop the link in the chat, and then people will be able to pick that up. And the last slide is a thank you for everyone who could attend.
And that's it. So yes, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I appreciate there's a lot to go through, but your feedback and insight is absolutely valuable to making this work. These procurements or these agreements aren't developed in isolation just by CCS looking Andy in a cupboard and telling him to come out 2 years later with an agreement. Market engagement from both yourselves and the buyers is absolutely key, especially as we move towards agreements that have to have more longevity. So, building that flexibility and building that breadth of support for things like innovation and new products, etc. So thank you so much. Andy or Steve, do you want to have any final words before we let these lovely people go and get a cup of coffee and a lie down or after all the terms and conditions?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if others have done it already, but I just added the Tech UK link. It's the Technology Buyer and Supplier Forum event on 12th of June. But as Andy said, we're looking at other venues in the north. Thank you, everyone. Do follow up. If you've got specific questions, then reach out. If if you haven't already booked a one-to-one, we're really keen to follow up.
Mm.
Also, if there is anything that you want to talk to us about, current agreements, TTAS or VSIS, reach out to the team on that as well, please.
Smashing. And there's nothing else from me. Steve and Connie have covered it all. So thank you. Thank you for your time. We appreciate we've run over a little bit. And look forward to seeing you in June.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks all.